Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of Life Sciences in Focus. I'm Maria Mateos, and I will be your host today. We'll enjoy a presentation centered around the state of biopharmaceutical industry reports, and our guest will share valuable insight into the industry's outlook for the upcoming year. After the presentation, we'll have a panel discussion and a Q&A session, so be ready to ask questions. And by now, you'll probably know our panelists, but I will let them introduce themselves. Kalyan, would you like to start?
Sure, Maria. My name is Kalyan Obalampalli. If you think my name is a tongue twister, when I was born, I had 42 characters in my name. So this is the shortened version, but I just go by KO if that's easier. I've worked in clinical operations on the sponsor side for more than 20 years, and then I decided to start my own company. So I've worked on the sponsor side, but now I'm on the vendor side. So I'm the founder of a company called ClinAI, which helps pharma and biotech companies with vendor selection and management. It's a cloud-based platform, and I'm hoping to share my perspective, having worked on both sides, on the sponsor and the vendor side.
Thank you, Kalyan. Thank you very much. Brad, would you like to join us?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Brad Pruitt. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Lithium Health Systems. We're an e-clinical platform designed for decentralized and hybrid clinical trials. In my past life, I most previously was at Safe Health Systems as their Senior Vice President of Medical Affairs, and previous to that, I was with PRA Health Sciences and ICON as an Executive Medical Director, working directly with the decentralization of the clinical trials and clinical trial operations at the CRO. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Brad. And now our main guest, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Murphy. I'm the Senior Director of Database Solutions at GlobalData. I have 15 years of experience in pharmaceutical data science, working with everything from early stage discovery and patent data through clinical trial information, all the way to marketed products and commercialization and sales forecast. So, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I guess by now we're all eager to hear what you have to share with us today. So I'll pass the torch to you.
All right, great. So today I'm going to be talking about the state of the biopharmaceutical industry, specifically looking at data and trends on various market research information available. Every year, we do a survey at the end of the year about what we're expecting to happen in the upcoming year and what key industry executives are expecting to happen. And so what I'm going to do today is look at last year's survey, what the executives were excited about and not looking forward to last year at this time, and figure out, based off of data trends that we've seen so far through this year, was that outlook correct? And then what trends are we thinking are going to continue into next year? So with that, just a quick background on GlobalData and where this information comes from. We are a market research firm. As the name might suggest, we have a lot of information coming from tens of thousands of primary and secondary sources. We also have expert teams of analysts, epidemiologists, and journalists that are compiling unique proprietary content sets. And typically all of that data is available on our SaaS platform, where you can search the data and export it. So a lot of the information that you'll see today comes from this particular platform, but we also do that survey that I mentioned, where we surveyed and received responses from over 250 executives in Q4 of last year. So last year at this time, we asked them, as we move into 2023, are you optimistic about the industry's growth prospects during the next 12 months? And last year at this time, 47% of our respondents said that they were optimistic or very optimistic. Now, that might sound pretty good. However, when you look at the 2021 and 2022 results, we were much more optimistic in previous years. So this was a big downfall this time last year at the outlook for growth prospects during 2023. So this is something we're currently conducting our survey on the 2024 outlook. We are expecting this to increase quite significantly this year, but the prospects last year for the industry were not great. Specifically, we asked them what were they optimistic about and what were they not optimistic about. And we asked them that about specific biopharma themes, technology themes, and macro themes. In terms of the biopharma specific themes, there were many areas that the respondents were optimistic about. Cell and gene therapy was one of the largest areas that people were thinking positively about in terms of 2023. Precision medicine, genomics, immuno-oncology, all of those areas were areas that our respondents thought would have a very positive impact on the industry. Other areas mentioned were clinical and manufacturing outsourcing, patient centricity in clinical trials and empowering the patient, biosimilars coming to market with some patent expirations happening this year. In terms of technology themes, by far, artificial intelligence and big data were the two areas that the respondents really thought were going to have the biggest impact, the biggest positive impact anyways, on the industry this year. So we'll explore some data around that shortly. And then lastly, in terms of macro themes, inflation and drug pricing each led the pack in terms of having a negative impact on the industry in 2023. And we saw inflation coming into the picture last year in 2022, but we're going to go into some data today and look at how inflation has impacted the industry so far this year and what we can expect to continue to see into 2024. So going into cell and gene therapy a little bit further, there's a very robust pipeline of cell and gene therapy products. We've got over 6,300 products in cell and gene therapy. And those are across a variety of therapy areas, mostly in oncology, followed by CNS and metabolic disorders. There are currently 23 approved cell and gene therapy products in the United States. Now, that's not that many. However, 5 of those approvals have happened this year. So when you look at the percentage of the marketed products based off the year approved, this year has had a pretty significant number of approvals. Now, those 5 products are only going to reach about $6 billion in revenue by the year 2025. So in the grand scheme of the pharma industry, those 5 products aren't necessarily going to be kind of blockbusters in terms of the revenue they bring to the industry. But at GlobalData, we're still hearing every company, whether they're a supplier, a biopharma company, financial markets, or investors, they're all talking about cell and gene therapy. So why is that? The cell and gene therapy market is expected to reach $80 billion by the year 2029, and that's growing at a compound annual growth rate of over 50%. So you can see how significant this growth is year on year with new approvals that we're expecting. So 2023, yes, we've had 5 approvals in this area, but we expect this theme to just continue growing significantly over the next 5 or so years. And you can see here as well, about half of the revenue is coming from those oncology indications. Now, there's been a lot of activity in the space, even if it's not necessarily revenue from approved products this year. There have been a lot of deals that have been happening. So it's worth noting that there have been over 81 licensing and M&A deals for cell and gene therapy companies this year. Just to highlight a few, Astellas acquired Iveric Bio for some candidates they have in gene therapy for vision loss disorders. And that was $5.9 billion back in July of this year it closed. Novartis also purchased Chinook Therapeutics with lead pipeline candidates for rare kidney disorders for $3.5 billion in August. And then there was a strategic alliance between AstraZeneca and Quell Therapeutics for a variety of T regulator engineering cell therapies for type 1 diabetes and IBD. And that was worth just over $2 billion closing back in June of this year. So there has been a flurry of activity within the cell and gene therapy space and deals. Now, I mentioned those approvals this year, but it is worth noting we do continue to expect this theme to just grow in interest, in revenue, patients and lives that it's affecting. So back in 2010, there was the first autologous dendritic cell therapy approved. And then we had a couple of additional approvals back in 2017 with the first autologous CAR T therapies. And then there was the first allogeneic therapy approved last year. Now, I mentioned those approvals this year, but you can see that as we start in 2024, we are expecting to see the first approval of a tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte, or a TIL, in melanoma, and most likely the first approval of an autologous T-cell receptor product for sarcoma. Now, there are some other approvals that we are expecting may happen between 2024 and 2025, including an allogeneic CAR T-cell approval, but there is an absence of clinical readout data, so we can't exactly forecast what year we're expecting that to happen. However, it's worth noting from 2026 onwards, we're going to see more exotic classes of approvals happening within the cell and gene therapy space, which will just continue compounding on in terms of that revenue growth that we're expecting to reach that 80 billion by the year 2029. So cell and gene therapy has definitely been a significant topic this year and will just continue to grow. In terms of patient centricity in clinical trials, this is a little more difficult to measure, but one way that we can look at this is looking at decentralized clinical trials. So decentralized trials, you can see the dark blue here, both in number as well as by proportion of new clinical trials started each year, has been growing year on year. We're expecting this year to end with about 9,300 clinical trials that have virtual components, which will be higher than any other year. And you can see about 10 years ago, even 8 years ago, 5 to 7% of new clinical trials started were using a virtual component, and that's compared to more around 15% that we've seen in the last couple of years. So there has been a steady incline of decentralized trials, which again just kind of reestablishes the fact that sponsors and CROs are thinking about ways to make these clinical trials more patient-centric, among some of the other reasons why they might add those virtual components. If we're looking at trials that have been started this year, here we can see some of the top virtual components that have been getting leveraged. So mobile healthcare was involved in 24% of the trials that have started this year with 690 clinical trials. And this can include things like remote drug delivery, remote monitoring, as well as at-home nursing. Also, telemedicine was involved in 22% of these trials. And we go to a lot of events and we talk to a lot of sponsors about DCTs. And I think with COVID, we definitely felt an acceleration of DCTs. And it seemed like overnight, everyone was talking about virtual components and all trials are going to go virtual. And then over the last year or so, we felt that maybe there's been a little bit shift backwards. Maybe not everything needs to be virtual. And I think the feeling that GlobalData is getting is that the sponsors and CROs need flexibility with the trials. There are definitely some patients that want the flexibility to stay at home and have that virtual option if that's their preference, but there are patients that want to go into their doctor's office. They want to go in and get treated. They want to keep the situation around their disease and clinical trials out of their home. So we think kind of the need to have more flexibility and more options with protocols is kind of the general direction that we're hearing these trial designs will continue to move in. Another way to think about patient centricity is diversity in clinical trials. So we are tracking various races and ethnicities in terms of patient recruitment for clinical trials. Now, this data is a little more difficult to track for the most recent year just because the race data typically becomes more available as results are announced. So if we're looking at new trials that have just started this year, there aren't that many results announced quite yet. However, it's also worth noting there has been a decline in new trial starts the last 2 years with inflation, which we'll come back to in a moment. So one significant statistic that I did see was for the trials that are disclosing race, 73% of those clinical trials are not including white patients. So they are definitely looking and targeting more specific patient populations in terms of Black African American patients as well as Asian American patients. And this is just here looking at US clinical trials that are single country. This has been sort of a hotter topic, I think, in the US compared to some of the other countries that we're working with. But that 73% of clinical trials, not including white patients, that's compared to 46% of trials last year and only 9% of trials back in 2019. So there's definitely that shift to really be designing the protocols specific to certain races and ethnicities. Targeting patients with skin of color has also come up in many of the events that we're going to. At the World Congress of Dermatology back in July, there was a lot of focus around this subject regarding atopic dermatitis and how important it is to really get more data and more research around this area for various races. Now, coming to outsourcing. Outsourcing is another area that can be difficult to measure in terms of growth. But one way that we can look at outsourcing is based off of clinical research organizations. So this chart here shows clinical research organizations that have been disclosed for new clinical trial starts per year. So the data is still coming in, But our data is actually indicating that a fewer percent of clinical trials are being outsourced lately compared to previous years. You can see back in 2012, 2014, about a quarter of all clinical trials that were starting had a CRO disclosed. And in the more recent years, that dropped from 20% back into 2021, and now only 13% of the new clinical trials started have a CRO disclosed. Is it possible that the data just isn't available yet? Absolutely. Is it possible that sponsors are getting more private about disclosing their CROs publicly? Yes, absolutely. But this is one data trend that we have found particularly interesting that we will continue monitoring into next year. Now, on the other hand, manufacturing outsourcing has been generally growing. This chart here is a little bit misleading just because there has been a decline in new clinical trials the last 2 years because of inflation. But you can see in general, the clinical trial contract manufacturing agreements have been increasing, and proportionately with new trial starts, this is generally in line with the number of new trials that there have been. But one significant area, coming back to the hot topic of cell and gene therapy, is looking at the contract manufacturing agreements for cell and gene therapy products. So we've seen a huge increase in the number of deals that have been happening between sponsors and CMOs for clinical trials in terms of manufacturing these CGTs. And with the limited number of cell and gene therapies that are approved, there's actually more pipeline work right now for the CDMOs than the commercial contracts. However, we don't expect that to stay the same as more approvals start to happen over the upcoming years. In terms of outsourcing manufacturing of approved products, this chart shows new drugs approved by the FDA year on year of small molecule versus biologics. Now, we can't control how many drugs the FDA is approving, of course, but I did want to just draw your attention to this gray line here with the squares. And you can see that the number of biologics, or the percent of biologics being outsourced is growing year on year. Back in 2014, 2015, it was 35 or so percent of the biologics were having the API outsourced, compared to more recent years where we're seeing around 40% and above of the biologics are being outsourced. Now, with a specific look at cell and gene therapy, this is a huge opportunity area that we see for CDMOs in upcoming years. For cell and gene therapy, 54% of them have their API manufacturing outsourced. 31% of the dosing is being outsourced, and 80% of the packaging for these products is being outsourced. So thinking back to that timeline with those key approvals that we have on our radar, there's a huge opportunity here for the manufacturing companies, and we'll continue to monitor that as 2024 begins. And with that, we can now move into our technology themes. So AI and big data. This is a hot topic. You can hardly have a conversation without bringing up AI. We asked our respondents, of the technologies listed, what do you think will have the greatest impact on the pharma industry in 2023? And AI and big data really ran away with the respondents, what they were most optimistic about. Now, before we go into the data to look at what's been happening so far this year, I think it's also worth noting, we did ask to what extent do you think investment in new technologies will be impacted by inflation during the next year? And almost half of the respondents said that they thought they would have decreased investment in technologies. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. And then we also said, which of the following factors might hinder digital transformation at your company? Now you'll see insufficient funding is number 2. But number 1 is actually lack of specific skills and talents, which we'll come back to in a moment here as we start to look at the data. So AI, GlobalData is constantly talking to companies across the spectrum of life sciences on AI and where it can be applied on sort of that value chain of pharma. And there's so many different applications. We're constantly evolving this slide as we talk to companies and work closely with them to sort of strategize around different AI themes. Looking at companies and talking about AI within their company filings. Here you can see just the extreme increase that we've seen over the last year in terms of companies talking about AI or big data within their company reports, so their annual filings. And this is also worth noting, this is just data year to date, so we expect this to increase even more as the year closes. And you can see some quotes here about from some of our survey respondents about what they were looking forward to in terms of 2023 and applying artificial intelligence. Now, everyone's talking about it, that's great, but I wanted to look at the data to figure out how is it actually being applied and executed. So one thing that I looked at here are clinical trials starts for drugs that are using AI algorithms in the discovery stages of development. And you can see there has been a significant number of new clinical trials year on year that have drugs using AI. However, it is worth noting that with all these companies that are talking about this, we're still only talking about fewer than 90 new clinical trials that have started this year that are using drugs leveraging AI. So while 2023 is on track to surpass 2022, it's still not a significant number of companies, number of drugs and trials. Another thing that I think is worth noting is the jobs at biopharma companies that are being posted within big data and AI. So when the COVID pandemic hit, you can see an increase back as companies needed to review their digitization with working remotely and whatnot. And then you can see, in 2022, there was a big spike in terms of new jobs posted for AI and big data roles at biopharma companies. Now, typically, our jobs data grows over time as more companies are available, companies grow in size. But you'll notice here, there's been a general decline with a much sharper decline this year in new jobs posted in these areas. Now, you could definitely argue that maybe these jobs early on were filled, people are staying at their jobs longer, so there's less new jobs posted. But when looking at other types of roles posted, we really see a couple things impacting this here. First is inflation, which we'll come back to how that's been negatively impacting the industry. But the second thing that we're hearing from a good number of pharma companies as well as tech companies is that a lot of companies wanted to do AI and big data in-house, but they started to realize that they didn't have the skill sets. They couldn't hire from the outside to get the right teams in place. It was just too much work. So they started to outsource this. So that's something we've been hearing from a lot of our tech companies is that some companies have tried and then failed and had to pivot and move to that outsourcing model. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that for next year. We definitely expect AI to continue to be a key theme, but in terms of how it's actually being executed, I think that's something that still remains yet to be seen for some of the smaller to mid-sized companies that are just getting started with it. Now, moving to the last key topic of inflation. We had the survey respondents very concerned about inflation, and you can see a couple of quotes here where biotechs are sensitive to the cost of capital. The limited funding will inhibit sort of early stage innovation. Bioventures are the basement of the pharmaceutical industry, and they'll suffer from the funding problems related to inflation. So we definitely saw a lot of concern coming into 2023 around inflation. And in terms of the data and what these companies have been going through, this chart here shows the biotech venture capital, so biotech and pharma venture capital, where they have an innovator drug in their pipeline. And you can see how the funding has just dropped off both by volume and value over the past 2 years. Even if we had a blockbuster Q4, we're not going to reach levels of 2022, much less 2021. So, there's definitely been a decline in funding, as well as small business grants from the NIH. Those have been declining for over 5 years, actually. So what's at stake? What does this mean? There's currently 607 venture-backed companies in the United States that have a drug in the clinic. If you expand that to preclinical companies, it's over 1,500 companies. But of those 607, 218 haven't raised any capital in the last 3 years. 162 haven't raised any capital in the last 4 years. Now, your typical round of funding might last around 2 years, typically, they say. So these companies are going twice that long without funding. That's a lot of companies, a lot of jobs, a lot of drugs, and potential patients that they could be treating. Now, if those private companies aren't getting funding, we also looked at whether they're being acquired by larger pharma or whether they're going public. And unfortunately, the data does not support that. We're at really record lows in terms of both M&A deals as well as IPOs across the industry. But with all the buzz we've been hearing about with cell and gene therapy, I did just want to check and see maybe there's more deals happening within the cell and gene therapy in terms of IPOs. And unfortunately, That's not the case. There has only been one IPO at a cell or gene therapy company this year. So while we did see a lot of M&A and licensing activity in the space, only one company actually went public, and that was back in June of this year for $7.5 million. So the venture-backed companies have definitely been hit hard by the lack of funding. Looking at public companies and the lack of funding, here we can see how often inflation is being mentioned in company filings. So this peak right here is going to be the year-end, the 2022 year-end filings of these companies. And you can see that this was definitely a high concern. It was really spiking in terms of in their 2022 full year reports, what they were concerned about for the previous year and what they were concerned about for the upcoming year. However, the good news is that you can see in the half-year reports, which were announced in Q3 of this year, the mentions of inflations has been reduced by about 50%. So they are talking about it less, which is good, but it is also worth noting that they're also talking about innovation much less. So I think the lack of funding, the tightened R&D budgets, that definitely will have had an impact on innovation. Now, I mentioned previously when we were looking at AI jobs, how inflation potentially could be one reason for some of the outsourcing or the drop in jobs there. And we do see an overall general decline in new jobs being posted in the biopharma industry over the last 18 months, likely due to inflation, among other things. So this decline is not as significant as what we saw with the AI job posting, but there has been a decrease in new hirings at the biopharma industry. Also, in terms of clinical trials, I mentioned last year was the first year we've seen a decrease in new trials started in over 20 years. So that had never happened before. We are forecasting that 2023 will end at or slightly ahead of last year, but it will still fall behind the new trials that were initiated back in 2021. So inflation's definitely had a significant impact on these companies in our industry. It hasn't all been negative, so it is worth noting that academic institutions have been getting more NIH funding year on year. So that's one thing where they are getting investment, and we're expecting 2023 to be ahead of last year, which is good news. However, without collaborations and partnerships with sponsors, the innovations that these universities are working on won't really come to fruition without some of that public and private company funding and collaboration. So we definitely do need to see an increase in the number of partnership and licensing deals that are happening. Another positive note on inflation is that the average deal size has actually increased by 42% since 2018. So although there are fewer venture capital deals, the average deal value is increasing. This could be partially due to inflation, but we also think it's partially due to the shift in more of these VC deals being for biologic drugs, which are more expensive to develop, specifically with the cell and gene therapy expenses for R&D costs. We do think that this average deal value has something to do with the VCs as well as the drug developers realizing that extra funds are needed for those types of innovations. Now, I guess to wrap up, was our 2023 survey correct? I think in general, the outlook on cell and gene therapies has definitely been a key area of interest for everyone that we're talking to this year. Although there were only 5 approvals this year, there have been a lot of deals, a lot of progress through the pipeline. And again, we are looking at that strong trajectory towards that 80 billion by the year 2029. So this will definitely be on our radar to continue watching in 2024. Manufacturing outsourcing definitely is and will continue to grow, especially within the biologic space. So that will continue to be a key theme into 2024 and beyond. And then that patient empowerment and patient centricity mindset for clinical trials as well as marketed products is definitely growing. There's definitely that increase in virtual components and the need to have more flexibility with protocols to meet whichever types of protocol design each patient individually prefers. In terms of AI and big data, I think it's definitely been a key theme. It's had a very positive impact this year, but it definitely has not reached its full potential yet. We do want to keep an eye on sort of that shift in potentially outsourcing some of that, and it will remain a key theme for next year. Inflation, it definitely has had a very negative impact, of course, especially on some of those private venture-backed companies. How much of an impact is a little bit more hard to measure. It's too soon to tell, really, because those innovations that we're missing out on, if a technology is approved 8 years from now instead of 4 years from now, What's the potential loss in terms of revenue, number of diseases it could treat, the number of patients or lives it could affect? We could potentially see more deals with academics since they are getting that government funding. Could AI potentially help make up for some of the raised costs that these companies had over the past year and a half with inflation? So I think it's too soon to be able to understand or really measure the impacts, but it's definitely clear this has had a very negative impact this year. But one thing I didn't mention is that our clients are definitely more talking about the Inflation Reduction Act now. So I think as we move into 2024, that will definitely be a bigger area where we're going to try to understand the fallout of the IRA on these pharma companies with more restrictions coming into place. So that theme will sort of shift from just inflation to the IRA and the complications there. So with that, thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I hope you saw some new data or statistics that you'll be able to share with your organization or any of your partners. If you'd like to learn any more about GlobalData, please feel free to reach out to us. We have subscription as well as custom services. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. This has been very, very interesting indeed. And I have a lot of questions already. But let me kick off this panel discussion with AI. Of course, it's a trendy topic these days across industries. So similar to previous years, AI followed by big data received the highest scores among emerging technologies. And these two technologies, I guess, they can work together to achieve more. And this is vital for healthcare companies as it provides improved patient care in a micro level, but also more broadly drives a higher level of insight and trends that benefit operational and clinical efficiency. And I guess COVID-19 fast-tracked digitalization in the healthcare sector, but inflation, on the other hand, may be slowing this process. So considering the potential impact of inflation on tech investments, how do you think industries, and this is for you, Amanda, and the rest of our panelists, how do you think industries can strike a balance between staying innovative on the one hand and navigating the economic uncertainties in the upcoming years?
I guess I can go ahead and start with that, and then any of the other panelists, feel free to jump in. That's a great question. So I think with everything, balance is really important and prioritization. So I think a lot of companies are talking about AI, but it's hard to know where to get started. There's so many applications. So sort of doing that cost benefit analysis of, all right, here are 30 places we could apply AI across the business. Where is it going to have the biggest impact? But where is it also most realistic? So really trying to understand and not bite off all of AI at once, but take a realistic approach to it. Get vendors and outsourcing companies as well involved. Yes, it might seem like it costs more, but if you really kind of get all of your stakeholders together and look across the business at potential impacts, what's a realistic amount of work that can be done, and then working with your vendors to kind of right size the contract, I think that those would be some recommendations that I would have. Kalyani, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, first of all, Amanda, great presentation. There's a lot of information there. So a ton of information that's and a few of them are definitely eye-opening. I noticed that I think the risk-averse culture was almost towards the end where you were talking about the impediments to technologies. That's good to see. So anyway, I'll stick to the question. So as far as AI goes, I can talk about the operations side of it, right? I think that there's a lot of responsibility on the vendors too to make sure that they add value to these sponsors. For example, I've been at a few conferences where sponsors were talking about companies that can help, especially, I work with a lot of oncology companies. So trying to find patients that have specific mutations, et cetera, they can scan through the EMR, but there have been issues in implementation. When you implement this, hospitals may not allow for, scraping the data that the hospital has, the patient data, et cetera. There's some impediments to it. I think companies are making great strides. I think that's one of the things, as Amanda pointed out, is that I think, their sponsors, I think on one side have to get together and make sure that they understand what they want to get. On the other side, the vendors, right, I think have to be very clear on what value they add and the potential impediments that there are to some of these implementations. So at the end of the day, I think adding value is critical. So there may be a lot of AI companies out there but have they had enough data? Have they had enough, because it's garbage in, garbage out. So have they had enough good data? Have they had enough of those instances where they've run their algorithms to help clients, where they can realistically tell them what the impact will be? So those are my 2 cents.
Yes, and I think it's also important, AI in general, it can be really a cost-saving tool. AI automation in the long run, I think it's important to, think about that as well. Of course, budgets have been reduced for the most part across the industry with inflation and some of the impacts there, but, really looking for that cost savings of AI is definitely, I think, important to consider.
And if I can just add there, I think we talk about AI quite a bit, but I've been in operations, and there's so much scope for just automation, not even application of AI. Obviously, we can apply AI, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's so much opportunity for automation. So it's not just the AI companies, but any technology companies out there that are making life easier, I think, can add a significant amount of value. And I can just give a few examples of what we do in clinical operations that's very manual, how we compare budgets when we're selecting vendors, or how we are reviewing all the monitoring reports. Do we need to do it manually? I mean, I do know that a lot of companies still do it manually. Do we need to do it manually? How much time do we spend there? These are all things to consider, and these are all opportunities for which need solutions at some point of time. And it's not just about AI. I just wanted to make the point that technology in general that even can automate things has a lot of space to grow.
Thank you, Kalyan. Brad, I think you had a question too.
Yeah. Again, Amanda, great presentation. I got to see you live in San Diego as well at the OCT conference, and was very impressed and impressed once again. So thank you. So I was looking at in your data, have you seen any variance between the application, either investment money in general or the applications on the pharma side versus the CRO side, and really looking at where that benefit is taking place? Is that taking place more on the drug discovery side? Is that going more into the technology that's in the clinical trials and the data collection, or the operations of the clinical trials, or real world evidence collection side? What are your thoughts on that?
So what I've seen from my personal experience is that it really does vary on the company and their strategy. We've seen a lot of big pharma that have had their R&D budgets tightened, where they're actually using sort of automation and AI to prioritize their pipelines. So they've maybe got so many assets for so many indications, so they're actually trying to look at epidemiology, market forecasts, scientific evidence that they've collected so far to predict which of their candidates should they be really investing the money in, and really making sure they are investing in the right places. If we're talking about smaller or mid-sized biotechs that are working in biologics, manufacturing, applying AI to the manufacturing and supply chain is definitely a hot topic there, since it's so expensive and complicated to manufacture those types of products. Any sort of automation or AI that can be applied there to create more standards across the biologics market as a whole, as well as sort of individual automation per company, per product, that really will kind of meet the clinical and then hopefully eventually the commercial manufacturing and supply chain there. In terms of drug discovery, like search and evaluation, I personally have less experience working with companies in that regard, but I definitely know it's an area that comes up frequently. I listened to a presentation recently about someone that talks about repurposing drugs and how much easier it is to get a drug approved if it's already been approved for other indications. And I was like, how has someone not developed a model that can kind of look at what indications might match with that target where it's already been approved? And so I think there's definitely a lot of applications there. I just have a little less experience in that area.
Thank you, Amanda. That was very, very interesting indeed. And speaking of cell and gene therapy, I'm intrigued about the projected surge in the cell and gene therapy market, specifically in non-oncology areas. That's intriguing for sure. So considering this remarkable growth forecast, how do you think this evolving landscape will impact both healthcare outcomes and investment strategies in the upcoming years?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of non-oncology indications, I think I mentioned we see a lot of traction potentially for CNS indications and metabolic disorders. What I've noticed just over the past probably 18 months has been a shift. I work with a lot of hedge funds and buy-side firms, as well as private equity and venture capital firms. And we've seen a lot of them coming to our company trying to get data in general on the pharma industry. So whereas previously they might want to know about future catalysts that are expected for drugs, they're now looking for clinical trial data for individual trials, and they want to run that through their, like some of the quant funds have algorithms that they really want to get into the nitty gritty behind the pharma specific data. And part of that is really with that market upside that they see within the cell and gene therapy. You know, they see that $80 billion in 2029, and there's just a lot of interest from the investors in that space. So although we saw the charts where the VC deals are declining, because that average deal size is going up, I do see them getting much more involved, hiring more life science professionals that have sort of the scientific background where they can actually dig into some of the data and make much better informed decisions. Because again, if their funding is limited, they can only do so many deals, and they need to invest more in the cell and gene therapy companies. They need to make sure they get their due diligence right and are investing where they have the biggest upside.
Yeah, sure. Agree. Brad, do you have anything to add to what Amanda has just said, or Kalyan? Any comments on that or additional questions?
I'll be honest, I don't know if I know enough, but I'll ask this question. So Amanda, in the trends, right, we saw that the number of approvals were not that many, at least in 2023. Was there a specific reason for that, or are things not going per plan for these companies?
So I think generally there was no major approval that we were expecting that did not happen. So I think when we asked that question last year, what are you most optimistic about for 2023? What will have the biggest positive impact? I don't think we really quantified it by saying in terms of drug approvals, by revenue, by deals. I think that's so open-ended of a question that, I don't think there was any big approval that didn't happen. I think it just means that, that the industry was generally excited about the innovations in that area. And it's almost every month we have to go through our taxonomies and add new subclassifications within gene editing and various technologies. So there have been a ton of new breakthroughs, even though the approval data by year did not actually kind of reflect that.
Okay. So it's trending still in the right direction.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And since we have Brad here, who is one of our experts in clinical trials, I'm curious to know, with this rise, which is steady in decentralized clinical trials these days, what do you think might be the key factors contributing to this trend? And how would this impact the future landscape on clinical research and, of course, healthcare?
Yeah, great question. I was very encouraged to see the stat of the 9,300 plus DCTs, and that making up 15% or more of the 2023 clinical trials. So that's a fantastic stat to see that, and that's after. I know this year has been a bit rough on a lot of the DCT technology companies that are out there. There's I don't know if it was just because there was too much investment up front that had a little bit of a down slip this year. There have been some layoffs in the industry and a little bit of a slowdown. So it's it's really encouraging to see the statistics of the percentage of the trials going up. But I think Amanda, you mentioned it, a couple of the points in your presentation that, you're increasing the diversity, the ability, really that, it's a cliche to say, but the democratization of clinical trials in healthcare, really allowing folks from anywhere and not just, close to a medical center or research site to be able to participate. And, it's just that meeting the patients where they are, not having them have to go outside of their standard of care, which was something that we always, really would look at when we'd get the, have the protocols come in and like, hey, this patient typically would go to the clinic, 4 times a year, and you want them to go to the clinic once a month. That's just not even realistic. So being able to have that be something on their mobile device that they can do on their own in just a couple minutes here and there over the during the week or so is just really a much better way of collecting data. And something I've always said for years too is that we've got a lot of these surveys and you're collecting a lot of subjective data from patients along the way. I've always felt that the surveys should be corroborating the data that's collected passively and making sure that if you're wearing a Fitbit and you're noticing that the patient is more active and having taken more steps and more active throughout the day, that you can then ask a quality of life survey, hey, do you actually feel that your quality of life is improving, and have that response basically support what you're seeing in the data versus the other way around, trying to find data to support the subjective surveys. So I think that's where the DCTs and all the technology, the passive data collection, the machine learning to be able to look at that data coming in real time and really take a look at what's going on. So very, very encouraged for the future of DCTs and hybrid.
Yeah, indeed.
I was going to just add, Maria, I've had the opportunity to host a panel on DCTs. Obviously, a world is a little divided, I think, on DCTs. Some absolutely believe in it, and some have their questions. I think, but the one theme that came out definitely is that I think we kind of have been doing decentralized. We just didn't call it that, but there was some aspect of that. But I think the most important thing is, it may not be applicable everywhere, and as long as the focus is on patient centricity, and I think every trial needs to be considered based on a fit for purpose. So I think that the world is kind of divided, and I think now we're hitting that after the high during the pandemic, I think now we're hitting a steady state. Like maybe that's, Brad, one of the reasons why things have flattened down a little bit. But I think moving forward, I think people definitely want to use it. But I think the two things that people are really trying to make sure that they consider is, one is that it's patient centric, and the second thing is that it's a fit for purpose. But it may not be for every trial. Just my 2 cents there.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with that. I work with a lot of companies that offer various DCT support to both sponsors and CROs. And we've been looking at some of the data, specifically home nursing, for example. We were looking at clinical trials using home nursing and how much quicker recruitment is for those trials. But one thing that we noticed was not every trial is going to be a candidate for home nursing. There's certain types of treatments where you have to go in. So when we were looking at the top indications that are using home nursing, it was sort of later stage, more advanced oncology indications. And then pain was up there. I think it was over 40% of the trials by indication were across pain and oncology, which I thought the pain piece was really interesting because that just makes complete sense if you think about it. If you're in pain, you probably don't want to travel to a site. But again, fit for purpose, thinking about your patients and what really makes the most sense for them.
Yeah, that's certainly a very interesting comment, Amanda. I was going to ask if it had to do with certain diseases. Pain is a great factor, also aging, probably the relation with technology. Yes, indeed. Brad, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I agree that it must be fit for purpose. The correct safety profile of the drug being taken into account, and I think the other, I won't say it was like a myth that maybe got busted, but this the thought that originally that the DCTs were just going to make trials so much cheaper to run. I think that there's been a lot of data that has shown that DCTs aren't necessarily cheaper to run, but at the same time, if you're getting better patient diversity, you're getting better patient compliance, you're getting better patient enrollment, and you're getting more patients finishing the study to get the data points that are needed, that added cost and the benefit to the patient, it seems to be very well worth it to get those data points in and get those drugs across the finish line.
Yeah, indeed. And diversity being a key point here. So giving the evolving focus on diversity in clinical trials, which is great. So guys, how do you think the shift towards inclusivity in research design may impact the overall effectiveness and relevance of medical treatments across patient populations?
I mean, yeah, I think it's only going to increase the effectiveness of the treatments that we have Just going back to that atopic dermatitis example at that Congress that we were at earlier this year, I didn't know this at the time, but it really does manifest itself. The disease manifests itself very differently depending on, the color of your skin. And that data, there's just not data to support the diagnosis and the treatment paradigm for those different races. So while you might have one clinical trial that groups all patients as a lump group, or maybe it's more heavily white patients, that data just might not be applicable to other races, or you're really not getting as meaningful of treatments there. So I think it's definitely going to help. There will be more trials needed, much more research needed, but in the end, I think it will lead to better treatments and outcomes.
In medicine, you would say there's the rule of thirds, where a third of your patients are not going to take the drug that you prescribed. A third of the patients will receive benefit, and a third of the patients, the drug actually does more harm than it does good. And I think the more that we get the right folks in, different backgrounds, ethnicities, different, let's say you need a lot of different livers that metabolize the drugs out there to be brought into the given clinical trials to really see how these drugs affect and have their efficacy. So hopefully that rule of thirds will change in the future, that you have a lot more than only 30% of the patients getting benefited by the drugs. And we'll encourage more people to take the drugs, so you can lower that 1/3 of those that don't take the medication as well.
Yes, I agree. Kalyan, do you have anything to add?
I think they've put it well, both of them. Nothing else to add there. I mean, it could only be good. I think we're moving in the right direction. So more power to it.
Yes. So then I will move to the Q&A session. So we'll receive questions from the audience. Be ready to answer. Let me see what I have here. So one of them is, I am keen to understand how companies will thrive globally, so that we can in turn understand if any significant changes in the market could impact the business. So I guess,
Sure.
Amanda, I was going to say this is maybe
Sure.
more directed to you.
Yeah. I think that's probably a loaded question. You could talk about that probably for a full day or more. So I think I'm a data person. I'm a data scientist. I work for a company, GlobalData. So I guess my quick answer would be using data to support decision-making, to look at what's happening in the market, to build out different scenarios. If this drug is approved here and it's priced here at this price point, look at the international reference pricing and how that will kind of trickle through the global market and impact your ability to, price other drugs or competitive drugs. So, I mean, that's just one example for like a marketed product, but any single event that happens, whether it's a positive phase 2 results announced in a certain NASH indication or something like that, or just a new patent being filed. There's so many different events out there that can impact any given company and any given business. I think, having access to information and then bringing it in-house with your own internal data to really get a full picture of what do we have, where are we focused, what is out there in the industry, and then being able to have, whether it's AI or other types of scenario builders. All right, if this happens, what does that mean for us? What could it mean for us? Do we need to change our strategy, or do we continue forward? So I think data would be one of my recommendations, I guess. I'm not sure if the other panelists would like to add anything.
I mean, if I understood the question correctly, I think in terms of global impact, et cetera, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there in terms of how clinical trials might be performed in the future. Again, I was just at this conference where, that I moderated, where they were talking about a study that was performed in Bangladesh, a place that we haven't heard about. And we all know about what's happening in Australia. I think so. There are, I think it's a different perspective of looking at this question, but I think there's opportunities as to how your global strategy might change based on innovative ways of looking, because where there are patients, that's where you're going to find them. So there are something that's rare in the US may not be rare in Bangladesh, which is what happened with, I can't remember the company's name. It was one of the big top 25 pharma which did that. So I think there's an opportunity there to think about the global strategy, how you're going to spend your dollars, your R&D dollars, where exactly are you going to do the studies. If you can be innovative, I think there are some opportunities out there.
Yeah, well
Great.
stated. I think just that lowering the cost of accessing patients, if they're traditionally going to opening up another country and opening up sites in another country is traditionally been very expensive to do, and you really got to determine if it's really worth it to go into that next country and the next country to get the patient. So as that barrier gets lowered, it obviously is going to benefit the industry.
And I think also partnering, so having sort of local partners, if you're looking to expand to other geographies, that's a good way to sort of mitigate or share some of that risk as well.
Yes, having local partners is great. And don't get me speaking about translation and localization on clinical trials, because I can spend hours on that. And I have another questions from the audience. So someone is asking, how fast are we seeing positive impacts from AI? Are we at discovery stage, or are organizations making real progress with AI today?
I guess I'm sure I'll start with that. For me, it's personally been a bit of a mixed bag. I've seen some companies that I've been very surprised with what they're already doing. They've been building up their own internal data lakes for the last 5-10 years, and they're really quite tech first, and they've been making good strides there. But then we've had other large pharma companies that have brought my company in to actually consult and give like AI 101 classes. Like, tell us about AI. Where can it be applied at a pharma company? Like, they're really at discovery. So I've kind of seen it across a broad spectrum.
Great. Kalyan, Brad, anything to add before I will try to make a wrap up or a conclusion here about all this wonderful information that we have shared today?
I'll keep it short. I think there are areas where you may have seen an impact, like, there are companies out there that can help you write your protocol faster, or, by using AI. But, what is the ultimate impact of a molecule that was picked based on AI? I think time will tell. I think that's probably a bigger question. But, Maria, am I asked to ask a question that I was thinking about? Or
Oh, no, that's fine. Brad, do you have anything to add to what Amanda and Kalyan has just said?
I mean, from some past experiences, and you talk about the data lake collections, and I think that I don't know if everyone knew exactly how they were supposed to be creating those data lakes in the first place. So although that data is quote unquote there, I think the industry is in the early stages of figuring out how to actually access and use that data properly. And maybe that's some of the outsourcing needs of getting those experts from outside to help come in and really figure out how to properly use that, and going forward, how to properly record and place those pieces of data so that they can be best used going forward.
Great. Kalyan, sorry, you had a question?
yeah, I was gonna quickly ask this question. I mean, Amanda, I think the theme of the presentation, we talked about the funding and the challenges for smaller companies, etc. So, Amanda, I think people might be curious to understand, what advice would you give some of the startups out there, biotech firms, etc., in terms of that are looking for to secure funding in this uncertain environment? Any suggestions based on data?
Sure. Yeah, I think from what I've seen with the investors, I mentioned they're doing more due diligence to make sure their investments are the most strategic with the limited funds that they maybe have. But what I would probably say is look for the investors that are active in pharma, active in innovations that you work in. If you're a cell therapy company, you can actually see which VC firms have been investing in cell therapies the most. So you can really try to find the best partners that will understand your technology and understand the investment that it takes to move that forward.
Thank you, guys. So with this, I guess we'll be concluding that AI and big data are the health power duo these days. Inflation may want to try that digital party. We'll see who leads that race after all. And as for diverse trials, those are stepping up. understanding diseases, as Amanda said, across races, making treatments more effective and available for everyone. That's the key. In this sense, I need to add here that translation and localization in clinical trials will for sure help to ensure inclusivity, bridging language barriers, and making research more accessible to diverse populations, which is the goal. So I guess the big question is, how will all these parts will be moving in shaking up the healthcare and improve outcomes? And I guess we'll dig a little deeper on that in our next episode. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode of Life Sciences in Focus.